Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you guys back to my 500 movies in 2025 series. So, for this episode, this will be movies number 267 through 272. And first and foremost, I want to mention that coming up this Wednesday on the channel, I'll be starting a whole new themed week and I'll talk about a little bit that later at the end of the show. But the reason I will be doing the show on Wednesday instead of Thursday, like I typically do, is because this Thursday you can catch me over on the Horror Roundtable with Grande's Graveyard here on YouTube, and I'll be on there with John and his other guests, Dirk and Darren from the Eurocrypt podcast. That is on the Dead Pit Radio channel here on YouTube. So please be sure to check that out. Those guys are really cool. They know their stuff when it comes to horror. So we're going to be having a lot of fun on that show, talking about different things. So yeah, be sure to check that out over on the Grande's Graveyard YouTube channel. But as some of you may already know, if you watched part one of this week of the 500 movies in 2025, known as the Week of the Living Dead, um, this week is dedicated to the memory of the legendary director and father of the modern zombie, George A. Romero. And while I won't be talking about any Romero films on tonight's episode, it's clear to see that he paved the way and provided inspiration for all the movies that I'll be talking about tonight. And with the exception of the first movie that I'll be talking about tonight, uh, tonight we make our way into the world of international zombie movies from directors like Peter Jackson, Michelle Suave, and Lucio Fulci. But with this first movie I'll be talking about tonight, while it's not a masterpiece or anything, it's still a dumb, fun, an unforgettable zombie movie, from Trauma with just plenty of entertainment, in my opinion. It's a movie that I used to see constantly on the shelf while roaming, the different rows of VHS tapes at my local video store, in the 90s. And the name and the artwork, on the cover of the box always just made me curious enough, so I'd eventually check it out. And you see, as a devoted fan of zombies and the undead, I've went through every corner of the genre. I've analyzed the sacred text of George A. Romero, and debated the visceral poetry of Lucio Fulci, and just celebrated these modern reinventions from like 28 Days Later to Train to Busan. But for every movie masterpiece that elevates the zombie to a tool of social commentary, there are a ton of these grimy, low budget oddities, just kind of festering in the genre's underbelly. And these are the films that you don't show to your squeamish friends. These are the rites of passage, I think, for any truly dedicated gorehound. And among them, few titles are as unapologetically trashy as Pericles Lunez's 1987 shot on video movie Redneck Zombies. And to review Redneck Zombies by the standards of conventional filmmaking is really just to miss the point entirely. It's not a good movie. That you call a good movie. Um, the acting is just atrocious. The lighting is often non-existent, and the sound quality suggests that the microphone was wrapped in a wet sock or something. But to judge it on its own terms as a a piece of shot on video horror comedy, it's I think you're witnessing this kind of work of sublime, primitive genius. It's a and stay with me here. So if you've seen Redneck Zombies, you'll be like, "What?" But it's a film that really just kind of wears its bad taste, as a badge of honor, and, and for that, it has earned a permanent, and place in my zombie loving heart. But the plot of Redneck Zombies is as simple as it is absurd. This U.S. Army truck driver, in a moment of kind of incompetence, he loses this barrel of this radioactive toxic waste, in the backwoods of somewhere in Maryland. So this barrel is discovered by the Clemson family, which is this clan of dim-witted, tobacco spitting, overall wearing moonshiners, and mistaking this glowing green ooze for a key ingredient, they dump all the contents of it into their steel, and the result is this potent batch of moonshine that doesn't just get you drunk, it turns you into a flesh eating, gut munching zombie. And the film follows two parallel stories. So first, the Clemson family, and their neighbors, they begin consuming all this, monster liquor, just leading to this kind of localized zombie outbreak. And the transformation scenes are just are amazing. There are these cheap practical effects. The victims are vomiting green slime. Their skin's bubbling and just peeling off of them, and they all rise with this singular purpose, and that's just to feast on the living. So the zombies here, they're not the slow, shuffling walkers of Romero, or they're these kind of like spastic, aggressive ghouls who just cackle with delight as they're tearing people apart. Um, and so the second storyline involves this group of seven campers. Your standard '80s horror movie fodder of characters who venture into the woods for this weekend of fun. Completely unaware that they stumbled into this cannibalistic nightmare. So these characters are just your basic model type of characters. Just kind of cranked up to 11. You got the jock, you got the nerd, you got the promiscuous girl, you got the final girl, if you want to call her that. And their attempts to just survive, provides the film its kind of narrative structure, as they're picked off one by one, in this kind of increasingly gruesome fashion. Um, but what truly defines Redneck Zombies, is its tone, and it is a this full on horror comedy that leans heavily into gross out humor and offensive stereotypes. Like the redneck characters are portrayed as these imbecilic, incestuous degenerates, and which is a caricature that's so over the top it kind of transcends insult and becomes pure cartoonish. um, but the gore is just relentless, and I mean obviously fake, but we see these eyeballs gouged out with hooks, and intestines are pulled out and eaten like spaghetti, and in one of the film's I think most infamous scenes, a character is just mercilessly attacked with this weed whacker. um, but every act of violence is punctuated by squishing and slurping sound effects, and just a very juvenile sensibility. It's a movie made by people who clearly love The Evil Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but they only had a camcorder, and a few friends and a gallon of corn syrup mixed with food coloring. Um, but the madman behind this camera, like I mentioned earlier, is Pericles Lunez, and I guess I'm pronouncing his name right. It's a very hard name to pronounce. I'm sorry, but yeah, unlike any kind of horror masters who built extensive careers Lunez was essentially a one-hit wonder in the cult film world, and Redneck Zombies was that one-hit wonder, if you want to call it one. Like I said, I'm being biased here because I have a lot of fun watching this movie, but even though his filmography is sparse, making him a perfect example of that shot on videos movement. You didn't need a studio contract or a long career to make a movie. Just a camera and a very warped vision. But Lunez, he shot the film on this standard um, beta cam video camera, I think it was, just kind of giving it that distinct, washed out home video aesthetic that defines, shot on video horror. And this wasn't a choice, born of artistic, pretension. It was born of necessity. I think the limitations of the format become part of the film's charm, and that amateurish acting, from friends and locals in the film, the DIY gore effects, probably created in someone's garage. Um, and just that raw, unpolished energy. Or I think those are all hallmarks of his direction here. And while he never directed another feature of this notoriety, his work on Redneck Zombies, I think, is perfectly captured. That spirit, of of Trauma Entertainment, which is the company that would ultimately distribute the film. And he created something that was anti Hollywood to its core. A movie that just reveled in what mainstream cinema tried to avoid, which is bad taste, offensive humor, and just that cheap, spectacular gore. He's known not as a great filmmaker or anything, but as this creator of one of the most memorable and trashy zombie films of the 1980s. Um, and I think the legacy that this film brings is inextricably linked to two key cultural phenomena. And that's the rise of trauma entertainment and the rise of shot on video. Um, you know, with Trauma given that seal of approval, and while it's not directed by Trauma's Lloyd Kaufman, I think Redneck Zombies is arguably one of the most Trauma films that you know, and that's described calling it a trauma film is a description, that Trauma has ever released. You know, you know what I mean? Like, when the independent studio, picked it up for distribution, it found its perfect home, I think, and its target audience with Trauma fans. Trauma had already cultivated a fan base of viewers who actively sought out these bizarre and shocking and low budget films like Toxic Avenger and Class of Nukem High. Um, Redneck Zombies, really fit their brand, like a glove, pretty much. It's poster art, featuring the zombie in overalls, the beer gut, and the girl in the middle and everything screaming. It's became this kind of iconic image, in video stores across the country. When I was growing up, and just promising exactly that kind of depraved fun that Trauma fans, have craved for years. And its inclusion within the Trauma library has really kind of cemented its cult status and just ensures it's still, discovered by new generations of genre fans today. And going back to the other thing, which is it being an icon of the shot on video movement. In the 1980s, the accessibility of consumer grade video cameras was just revolutionary when it came to filmmaking. For the first time, all these aspiring directors could shoot a feature length movie for just a few $1,000s, and this resulted in this kind of explosion of creativity known um, as the shot on video boom. And these films like Video Violence and Boarding House, they were often like technically crude, but creatively unbound. And Redneck Zombies stands, I think, is one of the most successful and well known examples of this movement. It proved that you didn't need 35 millimeter film or a professional crew to create something entertaining and memorable. And I just think its legacy is a testament to the power of that kind of grassroots style filmmaking, and the idea that passion and audacity can triumph over a lack of resources. Um, and if you want to talk about even more of its legacy, it had an influence on future horror comedies. While it may not directly influence mainstream hits, I think Redneck Zombies is an important ancestor to the hillbilly horror and the zombie comedies subgenres that would be refined later in films like Tucker and Dale versus Evil and Shaun of the Dead. Um, it just it demonstrated that zombies could be hilarious, and that leaning into stereotypes, however crude to some, but it could be this kind of source of effective comedy. It helped carve out this kind of niche for horror that was self-aware, and absurd, and just aimed squarely at an audience that wanted to laugh as much as they wanted to be disgusted. But in conclusion, I guess Redneck Zombies is not a film for the uninitiated. Um, it's more of a cinematic endurance test for some people, and just that kind of that glorious celebration of trash for others. Um, People like myself, I guess. um, so I guess for like a huge zombie fan, it really represents a vital piece of the genre's history. Either way you want to look at it, I mean, it does. It's a reminder that before multi-million-dollar budgets and that slick CGI, the horror genre was fueled by passion and creativity, and just a willingness to kind of get your hands dirty, or in this case, cover them in fake blood and green slime. I mean, and is it a masterpiece by any conventional metric? Absolutely not. I mean, but is it a fun viewing for anyone who claims to love zombie movies in all their forms? Without a doubt. It's a film to be watched, I think, with friends, ready to laugh at every ridiculous line, and cheer at every gruesome kill. It's just this grimy, hilarious, and really unforgettable middle finger to just a good taste. And just the world of zombie movies is all the richer for it, I think. Um, but yeah, so if you've never seen Redneck Zombies, I suggest giving it a shot. Um, it is definitely, I think, a lot of fun, and it was just one of those movies, like I said, that I would always see it on the video shelves and stuff at the video store, and it was always just intriguing to me. And I finally checked it out, when I was younger, and I don't regret it. I was highly entertained, and I still entertained to it, or entertained by it, to this day. But I guess now moving on to the next film in this week's episode. So, for countless film lovers, the name Peter Jackson conjures images of these misty mountain ranges and epic battles for Middle Earth, and just that heart wrenching tragedy of a giant ape atop the Empire State Building. He's the maestro of the modern blockbuster. A director who is synonymous with that grand scale um, storytelling and breathtaking digital wizardry. But to truly understand the man who would bring Tolkien's world to life, one must first take a trip back to his roots in the unassuming suburbs of 1950s Wellington, New Zealand, and witness an unholy cinematic baptism known as Braindead or Dead Alive in North America, at least. So, as a longtime admirer of Jackson's work, discovering Braindead felt like finding this secret blood-soaked diary, and you know, I was first turned on to Peter Jackson's films with the Lord of the Rings. So the first couple Lord of the Rings films is what I knew from Peter Jackson, and then it was shortly after that when I was. This is in the early 2000s. I was in high school, and so a friend of mine actually had the VHS of Dead Alive. And I remember him letting me borrow it. And he was like, "Hey, the guy that made the Lord of the Rings movies, Peter Jackson, he used to be a horror filmmaker. So they let me watch Dead Alive, and just like, and it was all she wrote after that. I mean, I was hooked. I love this film. It's this key that just unlocks everything. It's raw, it's unfiltered, and it is, without a hint of irony, a work of just demented genius. Um, and to dismiss it, as a mere schlocky horror is, I think, to miss that point entirely. Brain Dead is this joyous, hyper caffeinated explosion of creativity. A testament to just the sheer power of practical effects and the most hilarious and outrageously gory film ever committed. I feel it's not just a great horror comedy. It is, I think, that very pinnacle of that splat stick subgenre, and just an essential piece of Peter Jackson's filmography. Um, and the film's premise is a kind of a twisted take on a Rockwellian domestic drama. So our hero, Lionel Cosgrove, is this hopelessly repressed mama's boy. He's utterly dominated by his just monstrously overbearing mother Vera. And his world begins to change when he falls for this very beautiful local shop girl named Paquita, whose grandmother foresees their love in these tarot cards. So the conflict here is classic. You have this boy who's torn between his mother and his first love, but Peter Jackson, takes that simple premise and douses it, in just absolute chaos. So during this date that Lionel and Paquita have at the zoo, his mother Vera is like spying on him, and in the process, she's bitten by this hideous Sumatran rat monkey, which is this creature of legend whose bite turns its victims into these flesh hungry, rapidly decaying ghouls. So what follows after that is just this escalation of comedic chaos that has never been matched, in my opinion. So Lionel, ever the dutiful son, tries to hide his mother's condition. Um, and this leads to the series of these increasingly desperate and hilarious set pieces. So you got a lunch with these high society lady, and that becomes this kind of nightmare of this oozing sores and projectile pus, custard. And then this at the graveyard, you got this punk party. That comes and just kind of sends into this full blown zombie apocalypse, and and they're kind of bullying Lionel at the graveyard and everything, and then that brings us the priest, who's like the kung fu priest who kicks ass for the Lord, and then you have this demonic zombie baby born from two of these other zombies. And then you have Lionel's greedy Uncle Les, who shows up to claim the house, only to become one of the lead villains in the film's final act. Um, And every scene in this film is just a masterclass in tone. And Peter Jackson, he understands that the more extreme the gore, the funnier it becomes. And the violence is just so over the top, so cartoonishly absurd that it transcends horror and becomes this pure slapstick. So characters slip on entrails like banana peels, and it's just a disembodied set of intestines that develops a life of its own. It's the Three Stooges as directed by a butcher with a film degree. You know what I mean? And then there is the finale. So, and I won't give away the full finale, but I think part of this finale is just the legendary, infamous lawnmower scene. So, with his house overrun by this horde of the undead, and Paquita being in trouble, Lionel straps this lawnmower to his chest and just wades into the fray of these zombies. And just the result is just this symphony of slaughter. A geyser of blood, limbs, and pulped flesh that has just rightfully earned its place, I think, in movie history as the goriest scene ever filmed. And I've heard Bruce Campbell debate that. He said that he feels like there was more um, gore and blood in Evil Dead 2 than there was Brain Dead, but I don't know. I highly disagree with that. I think that's just Bruce and the gimmick of having that ego, got to be the best or whatever. But I definitely think that Brain Dead has got to be have the goriest scene ever filmed with that lawnmower scene. Um, it's not just gore for gore's sake. It's Lionel's catharsis. He isn't just mowing down zombies. He's finally, violently and hilariously cutting the apron strings loose of his domineering mother, who has, by this point mutated into this house-sized wound-bearing monstrosity. Um, but looking at Brain Dead today, you can see the DNA in it of the filmmaker. Um, who would create the Lord of the Rings, but the he has that it has that obsessive attention to detail and just the practical effects, and it's this kind of analog precursor to the digital perfection of Weta Workshop, which is his company. And I think the ability to kind of manage this chaotic, multi-character climax with dozens of moving parts is the same skill that he used to choreograph the Battle of Helm's Deep. If you've watched Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, so most importantly, underneath all the blood and the guts, there's this surprising amount of heart in this story. The love story between Lionel and Paquita is just, it's genuinely sweet, and Lionel's journey, from this kind of timid weakling to this gore-soaked hero is really this a proper character arc for him. And Peter Jackson has always understood, that spectacle means nothing, without a human element to ground it. A lesson that he learned not in the fields of Pelennor, but in a suburban home, filled with zombies in Brain Dead. Um, and Brain Dead, is just a pure, concentrated dose of cinematic joy. It's a film made by a group of friends, in New Zealand who were pushing the boundaries of what was possible, not for a paycheck, but just for that sheer love of making movies. Um, it's a loud, messy, and just unapologetically, brilliant film that celebrates creativity in its most primal form. And for any fan of Peter Jackson, it's more than just a cult classic. It's a revelation. Um, and just to talk a little bit more about Peter Jackson, so I think he is one of the most commercially successful and just critically acclaimed filmmakers of his generation. While he is now globally famous for his epic fantasy films, his career began with low budget, independent genre films in New Zealand. Um, and what some fans call the Splat Pack era, which of his early career films. Um, his first few features, established his reputation just as a master of horror comedy and DIY filmmaking. And just if you look at Bad Taste from 1987, this was a sci-fi horror comedy about aliens, harvesting humans for this intergalactic fast food chain. And Peter Jackson filmed it over 4 years on weekends with his friends, and that's insane to me. And then you look at his film Meet the Feebles from 1989, which is it's like this depraved puppet movie that that was a satire of Jim Henson's The Muppets, and it featured sex and drug addiction and violence and just a hippo with a machine gun, and that's definitely one you should check out if you've never seen that. But Peter Jackson, he transitioned to more dramatic fare with Heavenly Creatures in 1994, which was a critically lauded film based on a real life murder case that ended up earning him an Oscar nomination, for best original screenplay, and it also introduced Kate Winslet, to the world as well before she would do Titanic. Um, but and he would later return back to the world of comedy horror in 1996 with The Frighteners, starring Michael J. Fox, which is another favorite of mine when it comes to his filmography. But Peter Jackson, he achieved legendary status, by directing, co-writing, and producing the Lord of the Rings trilogy from 2001 to 2003. And these films were a monumental success, winning a total of 17 Academy Awards, with The Return of the King winning all 11 of its nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director. And he later, directed the remake of King Kong in 2005, and he would return to Middle Earth again for the Hobbit trilogy from 2012 to 2014. And his work is just known for its epic scope, that groundbreaking visual effects, just that meticulous world building and just this underlying emotional core to it all. Um, and going back to Braindead's legacy is just profound. It's particularly within the horror genre and the independent film circles. It was just the pinnacle of the splatter genre. While films like Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2 helped define that splat stick, Brain Dead is widely, I think, considered its zenith. It took the concept of comedic gore and pushed it to its absolute, theoretical limit. So the sheer volume of just fake blood used in the finale with the lawnmower scene, which is reportedly, I think, 300 liters per minute at its peak. I think that is a testament to its commitment to excess. It's essentially it essentially broke the genre by being so definitive that few have tried to outdo it since. And if you've never seen this movie and you don't know, like if you think I'm just exaggerating, watch the movie, watch that final scene with the lawnmower, and then you be the judge. But despite being this movie being a commercial failure upon its initial release, which happens with a lot of horror films from the 80s and the 90s, unfortunately, but partially due, but this one was partially due to like multiple titles and different cuts of the film. Um, it found a massive audience on home video, though. It became like another one of those, like I talk about, rite of passages for horror fans, and just a treasured cult classic, which is celebrated for its audacity and its creativity. Its reputation has only grown over the decades, and I would love to know who like could obtain the rights to make more collectibles from this movie. There's I don't think there should be more collectibles. I mean, there's so much um, done, in the effects that makes it so appealing. Like I could see toys and masks and all kinds of different merchandise made from this film, but fortunately, you don't see a lot of it out there. Um, and Brain Dead was just a major influence, on directors who blend comedy and horror, um, and action. And Edgar Wright has cited, Peter Jackson as a key influence himself. And I think that DNA of Brain Dead is clearly visible, in that tone and the editing of Shaun of the Dead. And then if you look at James Gunn, I think he's pretty much said the same thing as well, because with his work, such as the movie Slither from 2006, it also kind of shares that similar spirit of, that grotesque fun that Brain Dead has. And it was just this, like going back to like the effects. This is just it was a monument to practical effects. It was released on that cusp of the CGI revolution, and Brain Dead. I think it stands as one of the last and greatest showcases of practical and in camera effects. The film is just this masterwork of puppetry and stop motion animation, prosthetic makeup, and these clever camera angles. I think it's a testament to what a creative team can achieve with latex and foam and ingenuity, and just it serves as an inspiration for low budget filmmakers to this day. Uh, but I guess in conclusion, Brain Dead, is far more than a footnote in a celebrated director's career. I think it is considered a foundational text for Peter Jackson. It demonstrates that raw, untamed passion and technical problem solving that would later allow Peter Jackson to build new worlds and redefine the whole cinematic epic. It is a film that just weaponizes gore for comedic effect with this unparalleled success. It really creates this spectacle that is just equal parts disgusting and hilarious and brilliant. And I think for connoisseurs of horror like myself, for fans of comedy like myself, and especially for fans of Peter Jackson like myself, um, Brain Dead just remains this essential, joyous, and just absolutely unforgettable masterpiece. So yeah, definitely if if you're a zombie fan, you've missed out on Brain Dead or Dead Alive, whichever you want to call it. Um, please check it out and just see what you've been missing. Um, but moving on now to the next film. And this is a like I should have mentioned this before, but with Brain Dead, it kind of I started into this world of international zombie films, with Peter Jackson and filming Brain Dead in New Zealand. So this next film continues that trend. Of these international zombie films, and this was a film that I did not see until I was sometime in high school, or I had just gotten out of high school after I had found out what it was. Um, but there are films that you watch, and then there's films that watch you back. You know what I mean? Just films that dig under your skin, rearrange your thoughts on life and death, and just they kind of leave you fundamentally altered. And for me, and for I think a lot of fans of the zombie subgenre, Michelle Suave's 1994 masterpiece Cemetery Man, which is also known as Delamorte, is definitely it's one of those films that just really makes you feel like you're altered. You come out of watching this, and just to call it a zombie movie is like calling Moby Dick a fishing story. It's a description that is technically true, but just misses that kind of vast poetic and philosophical ocean beneath the surface. So my first viewing of Cemetery Man, like I said, was just kind of a happy accident. It was, I think, shortly after um, I, I I was out of high school, or maybe I was. It was one of my last years of high school. A friend of mine showed it to me, and it was on VHS. And when I watched it, and just that VHS tape, had that cover that kind of promised gore, but delivered so much more. From its opening moments, I knew that this was different, and so we meet this main character, Francesco Della Morte, who is just played with this very sublime, world weary elegance by Rupert Everett, and in a role that I think that he was born to play. And he's the caretaker of the Buffalo Cemetery. And he's a man whose job is as mundane as it is macabre. So he reads the phone book for want of anything better to do. And he complains about his salary, and he methodically shoots the dead in the head when they rise from their graves. That's like, which is just a few days after the burial. And this is the film's like kind of brilliant central joke, which is the zombie apocalypse isn't this world-ending event. It's kind of this bureaucratic um, thing where it's like confined to a single sleepy Italian town. And Delamorte and his simple, heartbreakingly loyal assistant Nagi, they aren't heroes, fighting for humanity or anything. They're these civil servants, just punching a clock on the just that dread of existence. And Delamorte's primary emotion isn't fear, but more of a profound and soul crushing type feeling. You know what I mean? Like his gun isn't a weapon of survival. It's a tool of his trade. No, which is no different from Nagi's shovel. Um, so the film's tone is just kind of this tightrope walk over a canyon of absurdity, and Michelle Suave never once stumbles at this. One moment we witness, a zombie scout leader, get his head comically impaled on a shovel. The next, we're swept up in this moment of genuine gothic romance as Del Morte, he falls hopelessly in love with this beautiful unnamed widow, whom he just simply calls she. And their love scene or sex scene, which is set atop her husband's tomb in the dead of the night, is one of the most strangely beautiful and erotic sequences in horror history. It's a perfect encapsulation of that film's of that film's just the beauty of it all. Just finding beauty and love amidst decay and death, and just of course in this town of Buffalo, love is as fleeting as life. It's the character that simply known as she dies, only to return as one of the undead, forcing Delamorte into this kind of act of profound romantic tragedy. And this is the event that really just cracks his already psyche, which is already fragile. Um, but from this point on, the film descends with him into this kind of surrealist fever dream. He begins seeing her likeness everywhere. And other women who are kind of drawn into his orbit, only to just meet these similarly grim fates. And you're thinking, is he cursed? Is he insane? Or is the world itself, simply a broken reflection of his own soul? I mean, the film is just littered with these kind of unforgettable, dreamlike vignettes that feel, torn from just the pages of a morbid fairy tale. You know, the zombie biker who returns from the grave, flying out of the grave on his motorcycle. You got Nagi falling in love with the severed, reanimated head of the mayor's daughter. which he courts with stolen jewelry and television. Um, but the impotent Delamorte discovering that he can only perform sexually after killing someone. So each scene is this just bizarre, darkly humorous, and just often, um, poignant, exploration of the film's core themes. And what truly elevates Cemetery Man, from this kind of cult oddity to this, philosophical masterpiece is its, relentless questioning of reality. So Delamorte's, narration is just kind of a stream of consciousness filled with poetic despair. It's my job to kill the dead, and I'm not so sure that they're not the ones who are better off. So as his kind of sanity starts to fray, the line between the living and the dead, and reality and hallucination, it kind of blurs completely. He begins to see the living as the true monsters, and these empty shells that are waiting for a death that might never bring peace. So his quest for answers leads him not to a cure for the zombie plague, but to this kind of confrontation with just the very nature of his own existence. And then there's the ending of this film. So without trying to spoil its sublime power that it has, I think it is one of the most audacious and mind-bending, and haunting conclusions in all of movie history. It recontextualizes everything we have just seen. It makes you rethink everything that you've just watched. It transformed the film from this story about a man in a town to a story about a man, trapped in his own world. Of his own making. It's a moment of just this pure cinematic poetry that leaves you, very contemplative. This which it's almost like a gut punch that really stays with you for a long time. Um, but Cemetery Man, is a film for those who appreciate that horror can be more than just jump scares and gore. It's a film that uses the undead as a metaphor. Um, as a metaphor for just the absurdity of life, and that futility of love in a decaying world, and also just that terrifying possibility that our reality is far more fragile than we think. So it's beautiful, it's disgusting, it's hilarious, it's tragic, and it's profound all at once. I think it is the last great Italian horror film, for that time, and which is, a very magnificent, melancholic, swan song for a genre, and just a timeless work of art, at that, much like it's, the returners, as he would call them, which is the way his word for the zombies. It will never truly die. So the director of this film, like I said, is Michelle Suave. And Michelle Suave was this. He was this Italian filmmaker who was, I think, considered one of the last great masters of the Italian horror genre. He began his career as a protege of the legendary Dario Argento, serving as an assistant director on landmark films like Tenebrae and Phenomena. And he also worked with other notable directors like Lamberto Bava and even Terry Gilliam on the adventures of Baron Munchausen. So Michelle Suave's directorial style is just known for its, incredible visual flair, that dreamlike logic, and that baroque, almost painter like compositions. He's less interested in that visceral, gritty gore like Lucio Fulci, and more in like creating a more pervasive sense of like atmosphere and surreal beauty. Um, his key films, leading up to Cemetery Man, really established his reputations like Stage Fright from 1987, which was this, highly stylized and slasher film about a killer in an owl mask, stalking this troupe of actors locked a theater overnight, and I think it's celebrated, for its kind of stunning visuals and suspense. And then you got The Church from 1989, which was produced by Argento, and this is a gothic and atmospheric, horror film about this cursed medieval cathedral unleashing demonic forces in the present day. But Cemetery Man, I think, is widely regarded as his greatest film. The movie, where his kind of visual elegance and thematic ambition, and that penchant for the bizarre, all came together in this kind of perfect singular vision. But the legacy of Cemetery Man is that it is this quintessential cult classic. Its impact was not immediate, but has grown steadily, over time, and it cemented its place as a unique and beloved masterpiece of just genre cinema. Um, you know, and again, like I've stated about a lot of films I've talked about here on the channel, Cemetery Man was a commercial flop. So in the United States, it was poorly marketed by its distributor, who tried to sell it, as a straightforward zombie comedy in the vein of Evil Dead 2. And audiences, expected a simple gore fest, and but they were bewildered by its kind of philosophical, you know, that philosophical musings, that right, and that surrealism, and that melancholic tone. Um, but like a lot of movies that I talk about on here, it found its true audience on home video, VHS, and later DVD and Blu-ray. Where viewers could just discover it, on their own terms. So word of mouth among horror fans and cinephiles, and just fans of Italian cinema, slowly built its reputation. Um, and as I stated earlier, the film is often cited as the last great film of that golden age of Italian horror cinema, which flourished from the 1960s to the late 1980s. And by the time this movie came out in 1994, the industry was just in kind of steep decline. Cemetery Man, stands as this beautiful, ambitious, and just self-aware final statement, which was a film that is both a part of the genre and a commentary on its themes of life, death, and decay. Um, I think its most significant legacy, though, is its complete refusal to be categorized. Is it a zombie film? Yeah. Is it a romance? Yeah. A black comedy? Yeah. A surrealist art film? A drama? All at once. It's just this tonal fluidity was just revolutionary. I think it has inspired a lot of filmmakers who seek to blend genres in these kind of unconventional ways like this. Um, and films with similar mixes of horror, comedy, just they all owe that spiritual depth to that trail that so Avi blazed. I feel, and just Cemetery Man, it really brought a level of intellectual and philosophical depth rarely seen in a zombie movie. It uses the undead not as monsters to be feared, but as this kind of catalyst for exploring complex questions about the meaning of existence, the nature of love, the thin veil of sanity, um, and just the absurdity of life itself. It proved that genre films could be vehicles for profound, artistic expression. And just the film's aesthetic, which is that blend, like I said, of gothic romanticism, that comic book energy, which is thanks to its source material, which I think is called like Dylan Dog or something like that. Um, and just that surrealist, imagery, which it remains singular. Michelle Suave's, masterful direction here just created this world that is, simultaneously beautiful and grotesque, funny and tragic. This unique tone, I think, is what fans really cherish most about it, and I think it's what makes the film just endlessly rewatchable. Um, But I guess in conclusion, Cemetery Man is far more than just a cult horror film for me. It's one of those one of a kind cinematic experiences. Um, this movie can be compared to films like Evil Dead and stuff like that, but this is a story of its own. I've never seen another film quite like Cemetery Man. It's poignant, hilarious, and deeply unsettling. Meditation on the human condition. It just kind of and it masquerades as this story about a man who shoots zombies for a living. And so through Michelle Soavi's kind of visionary direction and just a career best performance from Rupert Everett, in my opinion, the film just kind of transcends its genre trappings to become a timeless work of art. Its legacy is not in box office numbers or mainstream awards, but in just the hearts of devoted fans like myself, who recognize it for what it is. And that's just this beautiful, bizarre, and just brilliant masterpiece about love and death, and just that's it. About love. It's basically just a film about love and death, and that's the whole damn thing, man. Like, I mean, just check out Cemetery Man if you've never seen it. Highly recommend. I think, like I said, especially if you're into zombie films, you're into Italian horror films. It's one you definitely do not want to pass up. Um, but now this leads me to the last few movies I'm going to be talking about tonight. And, we ended last week's Shark Week with a prelude into our celebration of zombie movies, and where I talked about the 1979 Lucio Fulci classic Zombie. So let's bring it full circle and end this week of The Living Dead by talking about Lucio Fulci's Gates of Hell trilogy, starting off with 1980's City of the Living Dead. So, to truly appreciate Lucio Fulci's City of the Living Dead, one must abandon, the conventional expectations of narrative cinema. You don't simply watch this film; you have to just let yourself go and surrender to what is happening on screen. It's not a story to be followed, but just kind of like a nightmare, like a dreamlike experience. This fever dream of rot and maggots and cosmic dread, just painted onto film by this master who just understood that true horror lies not in a coherent plot, but in that oppressive, kind of suffocating atmosphere, of this world gone mad. And as the first chapter in his unofficial Gates of Hell trilogy, City of the Living Dead is a raw, like hallucinatory, just utterly brilliant symphony of decay that stands as one, I think, of the purest expressions of the director's singular vision. For a Fulci fanatic, this film is foundational. So while Zombie gave us that iconic eye gouge and underwater zombie versus shark brawl, City of the Living Dead is where Fulci truly leaned into that surrealism that would define his greatest works. The film operates on just this pure dream logic. Why does a window explode in a psychic seance room in New York when a priest hangs himself in the remote town of Dunwich? Why does a wall crack and spew forth maggots? Why does a dead priest teleport around town, staring his victims to death until their eyes bleed and they vomit, their own intestines? So to ask why is to miss the point. And in a nightmare, these things simply happen. In our dreams or nightmares, these things just happen, and we have no explanation for them. And Fulci forces us to witness these like nightmares in this kind of unflinching, grotesque detail. So the film's set pieces are just the stuff of legend here. That infamous, gut spewing scene is just a masterpiece of practical effects and so prolonged and repulsive that it almost becomes like a hypnotic work of art. And then you got the drill to the head sequence on Bob is just this brutal, visceral assault on the senses. Um, but beyond the gore, though, the film's pervasive sense of dread that that really seeps into you. So Sergio Salvati's cinematography here, captures Dunwich as this place that's unstuck from time. Perpetually just cloaked in this thick, unnatural fog, uh, and every frame feels damp and cold and haunted. And this is all just amplified by Fabio Frizzi's score, with that thunderous gothic synthesizers that are just as iconic and essential as the visuals in the film. It's that soundtrack, to the end of the world, and I think it just perfectly encapsulates, the film's kind of nihilistic tone. Um, but to talk about what the movie is about. City of the Living Dead, is just this supernatural horror film, that blends elements of the cosmic Lovecraft like terror with the zombie subgenre. The plot begins with this chilling prologue in um, in New England. I had to think there for a second, but it's in this New England town of Dunwich. So Father William Thomas, who's this tormented priest, he hangs himself in the local cemetery, and his suicide, is prophesied in this ancient book of Enoch, which acts as a key, opening one of the seven gates of hell. So this event causes this psychic medium in New York City, Mary Woodhouse, who's played by Catriona McCall, one of Fulci's beloved muses, just have this terrifying vision of the death of the priest and that subsequent unleashing of the undead. So the vision is so powerful that it seemingly kills her from sheer fright. So journalist Peter Bell, who's played by Christopher George here, and he's investigating her sudden death, and he's present there at her burial when, as he's starting to leave the gravesite, he starts to hear cries from her coffin. And in this kind of classic, claustrophobic sequence, he ends up saving her from being buried alive. And Mary starts to explain her vision to him that the gate of hell must be closed by All Saints' Day, or the dead will rise and irrevocably overrun the world of the living. So together they embark on this desperate race, against time to travel to this cursed town of Dunwich. And meanwhile, Dunwich is descending into chaos. This spectral figure of Father Thomas, appears to the residents. His malevolent stare just causing them to bleed from the eyes before, suffering these gruesome deaths. The town's dead begin to claw their way out of their graves. Not as like Romero's slow moving flesh eaters, but as these vengeful, supernatural like powered um, zombies. So this local psychiatrist, Jerry, who's played by Carlo De Mayo, is you know with his patient Sandra, and they find themselves trapped in this kind of escalating nightmare, encountering these brain drilling zombies and these other incomprehensible horrors. Just the film culminates in this desperate confrontation in these catacombs beneath the church, as our heroes are trying to find and destroy Father Thomas's tomb, to seal the gate forever. And this leads to one of the most famously debated and ambiguous endings in Italian horror history. Um, but as you already know by now, this film was directed by the legendary Lucio Fulci, often called the maestro of mayhem, or the godfather of gore. And while he's most famous for his graphic horror films, of the late 1970s and early 1980s, Fulci has had a long and varied career in just the Italian film industry. He began by directing comedies and musicals, before moving into spaghetti westerns, and then find his footing in the giallo genre with movies like A Lizard in a Woman's Skin and Don't Torture a Duckling. But his international breakthrough came with Zombie in 1979, which is a film that was marketed as an unofficial sequel to George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead. It was here that Fulci established that signature style that he would perfect in the Gates of Hell trilogy. Whereas he had there was this visceral, graphic gore, and that violence that Fulci would portray is not merely suggestive. He was a master of just practical gore effect. Often lingering on that destruction of the human body. And I think his signature motif is that extreme eye trauma, that splintered wood through an eyeball in Zombie, or a razor blade slicing an eye in the New York Ripper, which is a brutal metaphor, for kind of forcing his audience to witness the unbearable. You know what I mean? But one of my favorite things about Fulci's films is that dream logic and that surrealism. You know, um, he would prioritize like the atmosphere and that shocking imagery, over coherent plotting. His best films, especially the Gates of Hell trilogy, operate on that dreamlike or rather nightmare like logic where events don't need to make sense. They just need to feel terrifying. And I know of a lot of people I've talked to who don't like Fulci's films because of that, but I just think I find them more fascinating that way. And if you look at his obsession with like close-ups and especially like focusing on his the his actors' eyes, just to kind of convey that sheer unadulterated terror, you know I always found that fascinating as well because as they some you might have heard the saying before, the eyes are the windows to the soul, and I think in a Fulci film, you know we watch those souls shatter in real time from the terror. Um, but going back to that collaboration that he's always had with Fabio Frizzi, his visions were always amplified by these unforgettable scores of composer Fabio Frizzi. The main themes for all the films in the Gates of Hell trilogy, with their haunting melodies, are just are as iconic and essential to the film's identities as any of their visuals. You know what I mean? But initially, City of the Living Dead was met with revulsion by a lot of mainstream critics. Go figure, uh, who just dismissed it as this incoherent and gratuitously violent mess. And in the UK, it was famously prosecuted as a video nasty, which is, I think, a label that ironically has cemented its legendary status, amongst a lot of horror fans. Um, and just the film's true legacy, though, was forged in that home video boom of the 1980s, like a lot of these films I talk about. Just away from the judgment of critics, audiences discovered a film just an unparalleled atmospheric power and surrealist horror. Its influence is profound because this film, along with The Beyond and House by the Cemetery, just represents that pinnacle of Fulci's unique brand of horror. It moved beyond the Romero style zombie themes and into this kind of realm of supernatural cosmic dread. Um, just the idea of a plot serving as a loose framework for a series of these terrifying vignettes has just influenced, I think, countless experimental and atmospheric horror films. Um, Filmmakers like Eli Roth have openly cited Lucio Fulci as a major inspiration. Just the graphic, practical effects driven gore of City of the Living Dead is it really set this benchmark of for what could be explicitly shown on screen, and its set pieces are still referenced and revered by special effects artists today. Um, but over the decades, the film has just undergone a significant critical reevaluation. Scholars and dedicated horror critics now praise it, for its surrealist artistry and its Lovecraft-like themes of a hostile and incomprehensible universe, and its masterful creation just of atmosphere. It's no longer seen as a cheap B movie, but more of this legitimate work of filmmaking in the horror genre. Um, but you know, City of the Living Dead, it established that thematic, foundation for what fans would dub, the Gates of Hell trilogy. And while the three films, City of the Living Dead, The Beyond, House by the Cemetery, are not narratively connected, they still share this common theme where ordinary people stumble upon this breach between our world and a realm of just eternal evil, and it leads to this breakdown of just reality itself. But it's this movie. It's not a film for the faint of heart, or for those who demand that narrative hand holding, if you know what I mean. Um, it's just this kind of cinematic, descent into hell, guided by this director at the absolute height of his dark, creative career. It's this ugly and beautiful and repulsive and hypnotic film that just all culminates together all at once. Um, if that makes sense. But for fans of Lucio Fulci, it's more than just a horror movie. It's a declaration of that artistic intent. A testament to just the power of atmosphere, the artistry of gore, and just that terrifying beauty of um, just a nightmare. Captured on film. It remains an essential, unforgettable, and just profoundly disturbing masterpiece of the genre, and I absolutely love it, and I highly, highly recommend it. Um, but moving on to the next film in the Gates of Hell trilogy, which is The Beyond from 1981, and to speak of Lucio Fulci's The Beyond is not merely to just review a film. It's an attempt to just kind of describe this waking nightmare that's painted on the film by this master of gore. So for fans of Lucio Fulci, in particular for those of us who hold his unofficial Gates of Hell trilogy in high regard, this film is not just the trilogy's centerpiece. It is in my opinion, Lucio Fulci's best film. Um, and I think it is the purest, distillation of his cinematic philosophy, which is, logic is secondary to atmosphere. Narrative is a slave to sensation, and the human body is just this fragile canvas for for this unspeakable operatic violence. Those who come to the Beyond looking for a conventional A to B to C plot will probably leave bewildered, perhaps even frustrated. Uh, and I think they're missing the point entirely if that's the case. Fulci was not interested in telling a story in the traditional sense. He was crafting this kind of cinematic poem of this cosmic dread, and the film operates on this terrifying, dream logic where events don't necessarily cause one another, but instead exist as a series of these kind of escalating horrific vignettes, which is connected by this overwhelming sense of impending doom. And I know that's a lot to take in, but like trust me, like I've studied Fulci's films enough to kind of like understand and get the whole point of it, and I hope I'm doing a good job explaining to people that are not as familiar with them as I am. So anyway, the Seven Sisters Hotel, it isn't just a location. It's this like psychic wound, a gateway where the rational world decays and the rules of reality are they no longer apply. And what Fulci sacrifices in this kind of narrative cohesion. He he repays a thousandfold in atmosphere. That Louisiana setting with its humid, oppressive swamps and decaying southern Gothic architecture just becomes a character in itself. But Fulci films it not as a documentarian, but as this expressionist like painter. Making the familiar feel strange and threatening. And every shadow that feels deeper, every empty room feels watched, and just every creak of a floorboard echoes with just the whispers of the damned. And that suffocating atmosphere is just punctuated, I think, by some of the most audacious and unforgettable moments of gore in movie history. To a Fulci fan, this is not schlock or splatter, for its own sake. It's just that brutal, artistry of Gianetto de Rossi's practical effects. Unleashed by Fulci with this kind of unflinching camera. So the infamous tarantula sequence, I think, is just this masterclass in building revulsion and skin crawling terror. Um, the acid on the face scene is just it's just this kind of symphony of dissolution, both beautiful and grotesque, and of course there's that signature Fulci eye trauma, which is a theme that runs through all of his work, and finds its most visceral expression here. I feel these are not jump scares; they are slow and deliberate and agonizing set pieces that are designed to make you witness that complete and utter violation of the human form. It's an assault, and it's meant to be. And tying this all together is just that hypnotic, haunting score of Fabio Frizzi. The main theme with its kind of melancholic, uh, you know piano melody and just that haunting choir is one of the greatest, I think, in horror history. It's the sound of that encroaching madness, that lullaby of the abyss. Um, Frizzy's score doesn't just accompany the images; it elevates them. And it imbues that surreal horror with kind of a strange poetic sadness. Um, and the film's infamous ending, I think, is the beauty of Fulci's vision here. It's bleak, it's nihilistic, and terrifyingly beautiful. There is no triumph, there's no escape, no explanation. Our protagonists have, having stumbled through this nightmare logic that they cannot comprehend. They finally cross this threshold into this silent, gray wasteland, which is this kind of desolate landscape of the dead that mirrors a cursed painting from the film's beginning. So they are blinded and lost and just absorbed into the very horror that they sought to escape. It's I think, one of the most powerful and terrifying endings in all of horror history. A which is just this final statement that once you have looked into the abyss, you can never truly look away. And the Beyond is not a film that you simply just watch. It's an experience that you endure and survive. It is just pure, unrelenting, poetic horror. And like I said, I think, in my opinion, it remains Lucio Fulci's defining masterpiece. Um, and it stands, as one of the ultimate achievements of that golden age of Italian horror. Alongside films like Cannibal Holocaust and even Fulci's own Zombie, it pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable to show on screen. The practical gore effects by Giannato del Rossi was unflinchingly graphic and just became this kind of benchmark for splatter films. Um, and just the eye gouging, the headshots, and the acid dissolving face became legendary sequences among horror fans. I think and just and it influenced a generation of special effects artists and directors who sought to kind of create these visceral, tactile horror films. Um, and again, I'm always talking about the critics. While critics initially dismissed this as as it being incoherent, so the Beyond is now praised, I think, for its pioneering use of nightmare logic. Fulci demonstrated that a horror film could be overwhelmingly effective without adhering to a strict, casual chain of events. Um, its influence can be seen, like in later surrealist and atmospheric horror films that prioritize mood and tone and just shocking imagery, over conventional storytelling, such as Mandy or some of the works of David Lynch. Rest in peace. But this film's journey really led to it being a cult classic. It's and just its path of recognition was difficult. In the United States, it was acquired by a distributor who was baffled by its content. Severely re-edited it. Cut most of the gore. Replaced Fabio Frizzi's score with a new one, and then released it under a different title, The Seven Doors of Death. Um, it was this butchered version that most Americans first saw. However, through the rise of home video, uh, especially uncut VHS tapes, that were kind of traded back in the day. Um, fanzines like Fangoria and just word of mouth, its reputation grew. It became this like almost like a holy grail of that forbidden cinema. So the film's status was cemented, in the late 1990s when Quentin Tarantino's Rolling Thunder Pictures acquired the rights and gave the original uncut director's version a theatrical re-release. This event I think was crucial to its legacy. It exposed the film to a new, broader audience, and just and prompted this critical reevaluation, with just um, many mainstream critics finally recognizing its artistic merits. Those the dreamlike qualities and that surrealist beauty. It was no longer just a video nasty. It was now considered this significant work of horror art. And as I stated before, The Beyond I think is arguably that definitive Fulci film. It contains all of his major directorial signatures in their most potent form, from those extreme close-ups on terrified eyes, which him having that obsession with eye trauma, and just that graphic and lingering gore, that presence of these slow-moving Fulci zombies, the Fabio Frizzi score, and just that profoundly bleak nihilistic worldview. It serves, I think, as the perfect entry point, and that ultimate expression of his unique brand of horror. Um, but I guess in conclusion, that the Beyond is really this landmark of just of horror cinema that transcends its grindhouse origins. It's a brutal, just beautiful and deeply unsettling film that operates on its own unique terms. While it was initially you know seen as for its lack of a coherent plot, is rightfully been reevaluated as this masterpiece of just surrealist terror. A film that just prioritizes the atmosphere and that visceral sensation above all else. Um, and its legacy lies not only in its extreme gore, but its audacious commitment to dream logic, and its creation of one of the most, I think, hauntingly realized cinematic landscapes. It is a or hellscape, however you want to look at it. It's is a portal, for those brave enough to look through. The view is terrifying, beautiful, and unforgettable, and definitely check it out if you haven't seen that one either. Like I said, I feel like it's his definitive film. It's my favorite Fulci film that there is. Um, and yeah, just don't pass that one up at all. But that brings me to the last film that I'll be talking about tonight. So, as a huge fan of Lucio Fulci, just a huge fan of his Unholy Trinity, the Gates of Hell trilogy. There are a few films that resonate with the same dark frequency as 1981's The House by the Cemetery. Um, it's often cited as the claustrophobic capstone of the Gates of Hell trilogy. It's a film that just perfectly encapsulates Fulci's unique genius. Um, just a relentless assault on the senses. A triumph of atmosphere over conventional logic, and just a visceral journey into that heart, of an ancient, festering evil. And for those of us who love Italian horror, The House by the Cemetery is another one of those fever dreams. A masterclass in just slow burn dread, culminating in this explosion of unforgettable practical effects. Um, and at its core, The House by the Cemetery is a haunted house story, but filtered through Fulci's distinctly bleak and surreal lens. The narrative, follows the Boyle family, which is Dr. Norman Boyle, who's a research professor, and his wife Lucy, again played by Catriona McCall, and their young son Bob. So they move from New York City to this kind of remote Victorian house in New England, where Norman is tasked with continuing the research of the previously residing Professor Peterson, who murdered his mistress and then committed suicide within the very walls of the house. And from the moment they arrive, this oppressive sense of unease descends. The house itself is a character. It's this decaying entity that breathes malevolence, and the little boy Bob, with his kind of innocent yet perceptive nature, he immediately senses this lurking horror, and communicating with and often being warned by this mysterious little girl named May, whose origins kind of remain, ambiguous. Is she a ghost, a manifestation? She's something else entirely. They never make a clear, clear decision on that. But naturally, Bob's parents, who are caught up in adult concerns and rationalizations, they just they dismiss his premonitions. This dynamic of the child protagonist being tuned into the supernatural while adults deny the obvious is this kind of quintessential Fulci theme, seen equally, effectively in City of the Living Dead and the Beyond. Um, and so as Norman, he's delving into Peterson's research, he uncovers this horrifying truth that the house's previous occupant was not Peterson, but Dr. Freudstein, this depraved 19th century surgeon who conducted these horrific medical experiments. And he's seeking to prolong his own life through the consumption of human organs and flesh. And Freudstein, now this grotesque, decaying monster, still resides in the house's, locked the locked cellar. And he's kept alive by this gruesome diet that he's created. So the film then kind of sends into this relentless claustrophobic nightmare. Um, the house becomes a trap. Its inhabitants get picked off one by one in that Fulci like fashion, which is to say, with excruciatingly detailed shots of bodily harm, and like from the infamous bat attack to the throat severings, the agonizing dismemberments, of course, the grand reveal of Freudstein himself, which is this truly nightmarish, practical effect that just perfectly embodies, the film's sense of that ancient, decaying evil. Um, every encounter with the monster, or even just the manifestation of his presence, is drenched in this kind of palpable sense of dread. Um, the air is thick with like stench of decay, the unsettling sounds of movement in the walls, the growing realization uh, that there is no escape. Just that the climax in the cellar, is a desperate battle against against is against this creature, I guess you just call him, that defies mortality. Is a it feels like a master class in tension and visceral horror. Leading to one of the most, I think, famously ambiguous and unsettling final shots in horror history, at least Italian horror history. You know, what distinguishes The House by the Cemetery within Fulci's filmography, and particularly within the Gates of Hell cycle, is just its masterful blend of that classic haunted house theme with the graphic, dreamlike narrative style that defined Fulci's early '80s output. Like City of the Living Dead, it embraces that disorienting, like almost nonlinear progression of events, where character actions sometimes defy strict logic, yet always serve to enhance the nightmare. And then, like in the Beyond, it's like this ancient malevolent force that cannot be reasoned with or escaped. Only it's only endured until it consumes all. And here, however, the cosmic dread is confined to that suffocating, intimacy of just a single rotting structure. The feeling of being completely trapped with an unrelenting evil is almost unbearable. But upon its initial release, House by the Cemetery has often faced the same fate as many of Fulci's films, which is critical dismissal. Um, often labeled as just mere splatter or gore for gore's sake. Yet, like its predecessors in the Gates of Hell trilogy, and many other horror films of the '80s and the '90s, it quickly garnered a cult following, which is a status that is proudly maintains to this day. And for fans, its perceived flaws, like the occasional dubbing intricacies, the the sometimes perplexing narrative choices, only I think that only adds to its charm. And it contributes to that unique Fulci-like dream logic that makes his films feel like waking nightmares rather than these conventional stories. Um, for many, House by the Cemetery, represents Fulci at the peak of his powers during his golden era from '79 to '81. It showcases his unparalleled ability to to craft this oppressive atmosphere, and utilize these practical effects, for this kind of maximum impact. Um, and just employ unsettling sound design to create a sense of deep psychological dread. That lingering close-ups on gore, the relentless slow pacing that's punctuated by these sudden moments of shocking violence, and just that pervasive sense of decay and futility are all stamped with Fulci's distinctive mark here. Uh, and just beyond that surface level, the scares, the film effectively explores these themes of the past haunting the present, and the innocence of children versus adult denial, and just that terrifying concept of an evil that's so ancient it has become this intrinsic part of the very fabric of a place. So Dr. Freudstein is not just a monster, he's this symbol of history's horrific echoes, an entity that time cannot diminish. Um, but and Freudstein himself, with his kind of grotesque, decaying form and insatiable hunger, I think remains one of Fulci's most disturbing creature creations. The bat attack, Anne's death in the bathroom, the the sailor sequence at the end, they're all iconic moments, etched into the minds of horror fans that have seen these films. And while it's not as widely, imitated as say the Evil Dead, House by the Cemetery, contributed, significantly to that evolution of the haunted house subgenre by injecting it with this extreme level of like visceral horror and just this uniquely Italian sense of surrealism. It proved that a house could be more than just a setting. It could be a living, breathing, malevolent entity itself. And it houses this evil, and it's far more, tangible and horrifying than just mere ghosts. Um, but as the unofficial final piece of the Gates of Hell trilogy, I think it solidifies Fulci's reputation as a visionary who could craft these interconnected tales of cosmic dread, even if the connections were thematic rather than strictly narrative. It demonstrates a consistent vision across these films that humanity is perpetually at the mercy of ancient inescapable evil. Um, often unearthed through arrogance or ignorance. And I think a lot of people look at the Gates of Hell trilogy. Like I said, they're all interconnected, but they don't really have anything to do with each other. I think a lot of people, like myself, especially, look at them like a three film anthology. So like they're all different stories, but they're all kind of within that same dreamlike, nightmare like logic. And that's just to me, that's what makes them so appealing, I think, to so many horror fans. Um, and for fans of Lucio Fulci, especially those who cherish that audacious, dreamlike horrors of City of the Living Dead and beyond. The House by the Cemetery is not merely a recommended watch. Um, it's just this kind of essential rite of passage, like I always state. It's a film that just demands surrender to its unique rhythms, its deliberate pacing, and just this unapologetic display of stomach churning gore, all serving this kind of higher purpose of creating this overwhelmingly oppressive atmosphere. Um, it's a horror film that doesn't just aim for jump scares, but seeks to burrow deep into your psyche. Leaving you with a lingering sense of just unease and profound appreciation for Fulci's unparalleled ability to just that conjure that pure, unadulterated dread. Um, so the House by the Cemetery is bleak and brutal and beautiful in its own cinematic decay. That's a festering testament to Fulci's vision that continues to stand tall as a truly iconic piece of Italian horror cinema. And beyond the gore, beyond the plot quirks, there lies this experience that for Fulci fans is just nothing short of hypnotic and terrifyingly brilliant. It's a film that just reminds us why we fell in love with Fulci's nightmarish world in the first place, and why we keep returning to that dread soaked corridor of his morbid genius. So as a lot of the memes and stuff in the horror community you see, Fulci lives with the Gates of Hell trilogy. Um, but this week, outside of Fulci, um, going back to how we started this week with George A. Romero, this whole week was just a heartfelt tribute to George A. Romero and the masters of the undead who just shaped my zombie loving upbringing. To George A. Romero, the Godfather who taught me that zombies could be vehicles for biting social commentary. To Lucio Fulci, the Italian master whose films were just exercises in grotesque and atmospheric dread, to Peter Jackson, for showing me that glorious, unhinged comedy within an all-out, splatter fest like Braindead. And and then to Fred Decker, for the pure B movie joy of Night of the Creeps. These filmmakers and countless others, you know, they didn't just create movies. If you ask me, they built this subgenre that just became this cornerstone of my love for horror. You know, each film from the slow shamble to the manic sprints was a lesson in creativity and terror. They were more than just entertainment. They were in an influence. Um, they were an influence that just helped me grow as a fan. And for all the nightmares, the gore, the inspiration, I'm eternally grateful to all of those filmmakers. Um, but I guess that's it for this week, guys. I do have a big day tomorrow. I'm finally starting my new job in the morning, and I'll let you guys know soon how that's going. But stay tuned to the channel because this Wednesday, a whole new themed week begins as we'll be celebrating the world of werewolves, where I'll be talking about several various movies from the werewolf subgenre. And as I said at the beginning of the show, the reason I'm not doing a show I'm doing on Wednesday instead of Thursday, is because this Thursday night you can catch me over on the Horror Roundtable with Grande's Graveyard here on YouTube. Said I'll be on there with John and his other guests, Dirk and Darren from the Your Crypt podcast. That is over on the Dead Pit Radio channel here on YouTube. So again, please be sure to check that out. That's going to be a lot of fun. And I just want to thank everyone who either watched this live and was here, in the chat, or if you're watching this on replay. Thank you guys so much. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite zombie movie is, and why is that your favorite? How did you discover zombie films? Like, what made you fall in love with them? And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button just to catch more videos from me like this one. And as always, click that bell for any future notifications. So, with all that said, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. Love you guys. Have a good night.